Yeah, my name's Vic Fairling. My wife's name is Jan, and we have 3 boys, and we've been members of Twin Rivers for about 7 years. You know, our whole life, you know, we've been married 28 years, but we've only been saved 15 of them. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, when we got married, we didn't live the life for the Lord. We didn't understand. And when we got saved 15 years ago, I didn't even know the word tithe was even in the dictionary. When we got saved, we fell in love with Jesus, but we didn't know about all the things, you know, the things that go along with it, I guess. They're not rules. They're, you know, the worship. It's a blessing for us. We can't wait to tithe. You know, I could share about, you know, we talked about the awesomeness of, we were in business, and 10 years ago, you know, we had nothing. We had our home. I'm a terrible businessman, always have been. Jan always took care of the finances. I would give stuff away, and she's like, you know, you have to charge people for things. You have to. I mean, I was just a rotten businessman. But God instilled in us the business of tithing and generosity. About 6 years ago, we heard Pastor preach a message on first fruits, and it changed our lives. Me and Jan we made eye contact during that sermon, and I can remember walking out, and we searched it in the scriptures, and we found it, and we thought, wow. And we started praying about it, and we can honestly tell you, when we heard that message about first fruits, it changed our lives. We can sit here today, me and Jan, you know, we hear people preach, we hear missionaries come into town, and they talk about, you know, they see miracles. We've seen them. Our kids have seen them. We don't have to take time to convince our kids that Jesus is real. We don't have to take the time to convince our kids that Jesus works miracles. They've witnessed them. They've witnessed them through generosity. You know, we were going down to Tent Village before they demoed Tent Village, and it was amazing. It was amazing. We had started making ice, and we were making it in milk jugs, and we were bringing it down to them. We were bringing Bibles, we were bringing food, we were bringing everything, but we found that they loved Jan's cupcakes, and they loved ice and milk. And I remember one week we had brought ice down, and it was on a Wednesday night, actually. I was in town. We had brought it down on a Wednesday night, and we came down there on a Sunday, and Kerry was the homeless guy's name, and he come running up to me, and he kept running up, and my kids were there. And he's like, do you have any more of that Jesus ice? Any more of that Jesus ice? And we started laughing. We're like, what are you talking about, that Jesus ice? And he said, look. And he brought us in, and we had made a block ice 5 days. This block ice sat, and it sat in a tent with no cooler, and it kept your food cold. And my kids, we were all amazed. We knew that if we would not have been prompted, if God would not have put it in our hearts to go down and serve, that we would have been robbed of seeing that blessing. Yeah, so we brought this fish down, and then the intention was it was just one, enough for one. It was enough for one man, and it fed 40 people. And they all came up to us. We were amazed. There was no explanation, because I'm the one that brought it. I know how much fish was in that bag. My kids know how much fish was in that bag. We just all looked at each other. We were amazed. It is one of the most awesome things I've ever experienced. You know, through the generosity, through the tithing, you know, God walked us through it. He walked us slowly through it. When we got saved, God has blessed us financially. God has taken care of my family. God has given me the perfect job. He's given me the perfect church. He's given me everything that fits into our lives. But it's through His generosity, not ours.
Right now, I'm going to conclude today the generosity series, and this has been an amazing series because there have been some real miracles take place and revelation in people's lives, and I just think that it's been a phenomenal series. I know I've learned so much, and so we're going to finish that up today with talking about when is enough enough. Now, for many people, you may not know that I actually spent time in high school as a wrestler. And for those of you all who know what a wrestler wears, you are now scarred. But the point being that I was a wrestler, and it was my freshman year, and I think it was the second tournament that we went to. I had to face this guy who was the at that time, 2-time, ended up being the 3-time state champion. This guy was 6'6" with, just pure muscle, and at least that's the way I tell it now. And I mean, he was undefeated his whole high school career and went on to wrestle in college. And I remember going into that match having no hope of winning it. I mean, there wasn't a glimmer. It wasn't, barring David and Goliath, he dies on the mat in front of me. I wasn't going to beat him. And so it was pretty, easy to go into a match that you knew what the outcome was going to be. So I get into the match, and it's like, I'm looking at him like this, and the match starts, and I throw my best move, and then he throws his best move, and his best move was better than my move. And 27 seconds later, I lasted 27 seconds. I was pinned and done. And now, I will have you know that 27 seconds is as long as anyone went that day against him. At least that helps my pride a little. But it was interesting because as soon as I got up, I just looked at the clock, walked off the mat, and I just thought, well, I never expected to win. The thing is a lot of our lives are that way when we consider money. Money and faith are two difficult things for a lot of people to blend together. They're very difficult, and for most people, I think they've just accepted the idea that I'm not going to win in it. It's just something that I'm just never going to be able to be one of those people that's like a testimony, and I'm just not going to be one of those people that can ever win when it comes to money and faith. Money and faith are two of my favorite subjects intertwined to talk about. And a lot of people find that strange. When I talk to my other pastor friends and I mentioned to them that I was going to be speaking today and I mentioned what I was talking about, they said, oh, Lord, help you and help the people. Because nobody likes to talk about money. And but the thing is, I really enjoy it because there is a fundamental connection between how spiritually mature and how far you can go in God and how you handle your money. And this isn't just my observation. Jesus actually felt this way too. Did you know that that Jesus spoke more about money and possessions than he did about heaven and hell combined? Almost 30% of everything Jesus said had something to do with that. Is that because Jesus, was a bill collector or because he needed money? Not at all. That's because there is a fundamental principle that lies between money and faith. And you can only go so far with God before you have to include your possessions in your faith life. We're going to talk today about something that specifically that we deal with here in this time in history and in this place, which is America. But there are two underlying principles about money and faith that every person in this room should know. Every person should know these two principles because they are the base or the foundation for everything about money and faith for the Bible. The first one is how we handle money reveals our priorities. How we handle money reveals our priorities. Jesus said in Luke 12, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And this is interesting because money is probably, and possessions are the number one competitor for our heart in the world. I mean, it's probably the thing that we fight against and deal with more than anything else is possessions and money for our hearts. You see, if you gave me your Visa bill or your receipts or your checkbook, I could tell you what your priorities are in your life. I could tell you what you care about. I could tell you where you spend your time. I could tell who you care about solely based on just looking at your checkbook, because where money goes is where our hearts go. And that works in any way, shape, or form, Christian or non-Christian. It absolutely is true that what you spend money on is what you care about most in your life. Now, the second thing is that our stewardship of money determines our spiritual authority. These are two things you need to know before we can move forward because of the base for money and faith. Our stewardship it affects your spiritual authority. Look what Jesus said here in Luke 16, verse 11. It says, so you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth. Who would trust you with true riches? There's a funny story a friend told me, and he said a guy came up to him and said, Pastor, I'm really struggling with tithing. I didn't used to struggle with it. And he said, well, explain it to me. He said, well, when I made $50, I could tithe $5, and I could do that. And he said, and then the Lord blessed me, and I made $500, and then I could tithe $50, and that was good. But he said, the Lord's blessed me, and he said, now I make $5,000. And he said, it's just really hard to write a $500 check. And the pastor said, okay, well, I can help you. He put his arm around him and said, let's pray. Lord, don't let this man make any more than $500, because that's the place he can trust you. Isn't that true, though? I mean, That's true, because it's tied to, it's funny how we can trust God, but then at some level, this is a constant struggle, and it ties into our spiritual lives. But it's bigger than just worldly wealth, and that's what Jesus is saying here, is that the way that you take and handle worldly wealth determines how much real wealth, spiritual wealth, I will give you. Do you want to know why you may struggle to get a prayer through? Or you might struggle, you need a healing, but you can't seem to have enough faith to do it? I would look back at the way you handle your finances. And the reason is because why would Christ give these true spiritual blessings to people if they can't handle what he calls earthly wealth? Or in some places called it mammon. It's just something that's like, it's just little stuff. I mean, think about it in this way. You give your money and time and prayers to this church. You would never want us to put someone in spiritual authority who couldn't handle money. You wouldn't want a pastor, or you wouldn't want an elder who couldn't handle spiritual authority. Well, God feels the same way. He says, I'm not going to give you authority and influence and the ministry that's in your heart until you show me that you can handle money. And for people who are saying, oh, this is the kind of sermon this is going to be, I can tell. This is one of those that, is going to be where you're going to tell me to sell everything. See, here's the thing. God doesn't care if you have stuff. He doesn't care. He cares if stuff has you. That's the thing. He doesn't care if you have it. He just wants to make sure it doesn't have you. Now, we're going to talk today about something that's pretty specific to us. As a matter of fact, it has something to do with every person in this room, no matter socioeconomic background or where you come from, because it's unique to our time in history and unique to our place in the world. And luckily, Jesus speaks directly to it. It's not something that we have to wonder what he thought or anything else. He speaks directly to it. So if you want to turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 12, and it's also in your outlines today, I want to read you this passage of Scripture. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, "Watch out. Be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store this surplus of grain. And I will say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared yourself for? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Now, this is interesting to me because this is a pretty strong warning from Jesus. I mean, it says, watch out and to be on guard against all kinds of greed. Now, here's the difficult thing about greed. You don't know anybody that's greedy. And you never would consider that you yourself are greedy. I mean, you never would. And that's why Jesus phrases it this way. He says, watch out, because greed is something that sneaks up on you. It's not something that you would recognize. It's not like anger or guilt or some of these things that are easier to see. Greed is something that you don't see coming. It's something that you really don't. I mean, when we think of greed, we think of Ebenezer Scrooge, right? We think of this guy with a bunch of moldy money, not giving any coal to keep it warm. But that's not what greed looks like, because greed starts in our hearts at a very, very early age. We're all prone to it from the time we're born. And if you don't believe me, spend some time around some kids. If you've spent any time around any kind of toddler, you have heard the word mine. See, greed starts with a desire to possess. It starts with a desire that I need to possess something. But it doesn't stop there. Here's the thing. Because for the kid who says, that's mine, grows into the adult who says that he needs to possess something, but he needs more of it. And I went through this recently. Kayla and I bought a house recently, and it was interesting because we knew what we needed, the square footage, the rooms, how much, all the amenities. We knew what we needed. And then when you start looking at these houses, it's not enough to possess one. Then you need more of one. I mean, it's more square footage and more rooms and a pool or a jacuzzi, which would be better. And it starts, you just begin, and all of a sudden, it's not that you're greedy, it's just you're feeding this thing that comes so natural. You see, it's interesting because greedy is one of these things that we would never consider ourselves, but yet in where we're at in history and where we're at today, we are prone to this. We are prone, and it sneaks up on us, and that's why Jesus said you have to watch out for it. This isn't something you're going to see coming. This is something that's just one day you're going to look back and say, oh my goodness, all I care about is getting things and getting more of it. And you see, greedy greed is a difficult thing to identify because it hides behind some really good virtues. I mean, greedy people are savers, and saving's good. And greedy people are planners, and planning's good. And greedy people are concerned for their financial future. And wouldn't we say we all are? But the thing is that behind these virtues lies this insatiable desire for more and to possess and for more and to possess. And before long, it ends up running us versus us running it. And greedy people worry a lot about money. And if I asked you, today what you are most concerned with and what your conversations most center around when it comes to anxiety, it would be money. And you see, greedy people struggle to give. We all struggle to give. It's not in our nature. That's why Mom, when we had 2 cookies, she said, you have to give one to your brothers and sisters because what do you do first? You grab them both for yourself. It's not our nature. Greedy people aren't content with what they have. They're not content. And that's, once again, in my own life, I remember when we started our savings account, I said, well, if we can get to this amount, then I'll feel good and we can do other things with the money. And it's funny when we crossed that amount that all of a sudden it was like, well, it really needs to be this amount. And then when we crossed that amount, well, it really needs to be that amount. And there's this insatiable desire for more. It was never enough because I wasn't content with what I had. You see, greed does not know socioeconomic status. There are rich people who are greedy, and there are poor people who are greedy. And there's everybody in between who also have to struggle with this. And greed is not a financial issue. It's a heart issue. This is not about the dollar signs. This is about where your heart is. It's about what you feel in your heart. See, greed is this insatiable desire for more. It's never satisfied. It's never got enough. It just needs more and more. But it's an energy that was meant to be directed towards your purpose. But instead, it is directed towards possessions. And that's how people end up spending their whole lives taking and working towards this retirement or working towards this nest egg or buying that vacation home. And none of those things are bad. It's just when you spend your whole life working towards that, you are using energy that God put in you for a purpose, and you are using it to obtain possessions. And so it's misplaced energy and giftings that God's placed in our lives because we're constantly feeding this need to possess and more. Luckily, though, Jesus speaks in this passage of Scripture to 3 things that we need to be very aware of because of our predisposition towards greed in this world. The first one is, greed is often an attempt to create security. Number 2, greed leaves God out of the picture. And number 3, greed is short-sighted. Greed is often an attempt to create security. Look what Jesus says right after he tells us to watch out for it. He says, life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. You see, most people don't realize, but greed is actually fueled by fear. It's actually fueled, it's like throwing a log of fear onto greed. It keeps it going. Because we have these, like all human appetites, greed and this place in our heart is never filled. There's never enough. And what's interesting is that prosperity or an abundance in our lives actually stirs up more greed. Statistically, the more you make, the less generous you will become. That's just the way it works, is because I know some people think, well, if I can just make enough, then I can afford to be generous. That's not the way it works. As a matter of fact, the more you make, the higher statistics say that you will give less. And to see, it also doesn't make sense because we have more today, more abundance than any people in history. Yet we're less satisfied than any people in history. So there's this myth of more, that if I get more and if there's more, then I'll be safe and I'll feel security and I'll be satisfied. But that's what it is it's absolutely a myth. King Solomon, who had everything, and the Bible tells us that he gave himself of all pleasures, said this in Ecclesiastes. He said, those who love money will never have enough. They'll never have enough. Modern research supplies this as well. There was a university in the UK that actually did a study about what is an amount that people will see as enough. Like, when will you have enough? And what they found is that it's not a dollar sign as much as it is that people are not satisfied and feel secure until they have more than the people around them. No matter what the level of money was, no matter what, for millionaires all the way down to people who had nothing, they did not feel safe and secure or satisfied until they had more than the people around them. And as long as the people around them had more, they were never satisfied. We call that keeping up with the Joneses. We call that we feel like we've got to have that new something, and it's all based in what? Insecurity. It's all an attempt to secure ourselves. You see, what I've realized is that this search isn't for an amount, but it is for security. And it's ironic to me that on the back of the dollar bill it says, "In God we trust." But the truth is, it's the bill, not the motto, that we trust. And that's the thing. And what's really sad is this is no different in the church than it is outside these four walls. 21% of American church members don't give anything to a church. 71% of all Christians worldwide give less than 2% of their income. Less than 2% of their income. Now, I don't have the world in here today, but I got the church with me. Let me ask, why is it that we trust God with eternity, but not with our checkbook? Why is it that we can trust God with the healing that our loved one needs, but not to pay the bills? It's very strange to me the things we trust God for and how big they are compared to how small our checking accounts are, but yet we don't trust Him. You want to know why? The place that you worry the most is where you trust God the least. The place you worry the most is where you trust God the least. It's interesting because if you struggle with this, if you're one of these people that, and we're all these people, so don't let me just point you out, but I'm saying if this is you, you say, you know what, I do have this insatiable desire for more. I do feel like that I'm just trying, this security, I need it. It is never, ever, ever going to be filled with stuff. There's not an amount, there's not a buy, there's nothing that will ever fill that. And until you replace your fears with His promises, you will continue on that rat race. You will follow this your whole life, and at the end, we're going to talk about what the end of our lives looks like. You're going to have nothing to show for it because you spent your whole life searching for security in stuff that could never give you security. If you take, and you're here today and you're just concerned, I've got to have enough. I mean, I grew up in a place that we didn't have enough, and I've got to have enough. On this side, you can have the worry and anxiety of fear of producing it yourself, or you can trust God, and you can have an open heaven over your life, and you can have someone who their name is Jehovah Jireh, a provider. So you can replace your fears with His promises. If you're here today and in this economy you're concerned that you will not have a job, you can go with that fear, or you can stand on the promise that even during the plagues were hitting Egypt, that God did not let a single plague touch His people during that time, and that they actually grew in wealth. If you're here today and you have insecurity about the status, the way you look and what you drive and the house you have, you can either fight that your whole life, or you can know that God knows exactly where you are, you're exactly where He created you to be, that you're fearfully and wonderfully made, and that He knows exactly what you need, and that He doesn't compare you to anyone else. If you're here today and you say, well, I'm alone, I live in a city all by myself, and I don't have people, I've got to be my support, so I've got to make my security. You can have that, or you can have a father to the fatherless and a person who sticks closer than a brother. We have to replace our need for security with faith and trust in Him, or you'll continue on this rat race your whole life. Now, greed leaves God out of the picture. It leaves God out of the picture. Look at the verse of Scripture. It says, He thought to himself. Did you know in this passage of Scripture, which isn't that big, there are 14 references this man makes to himself. 14 I's, 14's I will, 14 I thought to myself, 14. God was never in the picture. I mean, He never considered it. He considered everything to be about Himself. What's interesting about that is he's a farmer. Now, being a farmer depends a whole lot on God and things you can't control. I mean, you got to put something in the ground, and you've got to trust that the environment and the soil and the weather, all that you cannot control, build towards that. So it's interesting because this greed says, I earned this. But the thing is you can't earn something God owns. You cannot earn something that God owns. this is something that we have to get rid of. George Mueller says that we are all just but stewards because God owns it all. And with being stewards, that means that we just manage it for Him. And if you give somebody money, your financial advisor, money to manage for you, you expect him to use it for the purposes that he or you care about, right? The greatest gift we could give ourselves is to get rid of our owner mentality. The idea that we own it all. People who think they own it all have a problem, and the problem is trusting God. That's the problem, because if you think you owned it, you have forgotten that He's the one that owns all of it, and you are just but a steward, and you have a problem trusting God. And it's interesting because God specifically, the whole Bible is built on not believing in God, but trusting Him. God doesn't care if you believe in Him. He exists whether you believe in Him or not. He cares if you trust Him. And that's why when the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, they're leaving Egypt and they're going to the Promised Land. God gives them direction, pillar by day, fire by night, without them asking. He gives them security without them asking. He gives them clothes that do not tear up and do not deteriorate for 40 years without asking. There's one thing He makes them trust Him for. One thing. One thing they could not keep for themselves and they could not be their own. They had to trust Him for it. What was it? Their source, food. He said, if you keep it, I'm going to send manna down and I'm going to provide it. And if you keep it, it will rot before the next morning. Why? Why would God say that, okay, I'm going to do these things without you asking, but this one thing? Because every day that they had to walk out and pick that stuff off all the ground, it was a day of saying, I can trust God to be my source. I can trust God to be my source. I can trust God to be my source. I can trust God. And the longer that they trusted God to be their source, the less they began to worry about all the other stuff that took. God was literally setting them up, just in the same way we train a child, to trust Him. To trust Him. Now, and it's funny, He set the exact same thing up for us. You may not realize it, but the exact same thing. God established a first fruits offering, our tithes, for this exact same purpose. Not because God is not a bookie that requires 10%, okay? He's not. God set this up so that we would trust Him. See, and here's the thing that's so sad about this, is most believers never get here. Most believers never get to the point of tithing. And there's so many things that come with that because it's a new level of trust in your life. But look at this. Tithing is not just a percentage, it is a principle of firsts. It is saying what is priority in our lives. Okay? Look what Proverbs 3:9 says. Honor the Lord with your possession and the first fruits of your increase. Deuteronomy 14:23. The purpose of tithing is to teach you to always put God first in your lives. You see, God wants to be first in everything, not just money. We've isolated this down to just one thing. When we fast and give God the first part of our year, He takes notice. When we give God the first part of our week and come and worship Him, He sees that. When we give God the first part of our day in devotions and spending time with Him, He realizes who's priority. And when it makes it to our possessions, to where we say that God, what you have put in my hand, I'm returning back to you in trust, then it really gets God's attention. But the thing that most people don't realize is that tithing is a test. It's a test. It's not something that is just, God didn't randomly come up with this stuff. It's a test to help you trust Him. Here's how it was set up. That when a lamb was born, the first lamb born was given to God. It's making Him first. So that means that I may not know if I'll have any other lambs. It's not when I have 10 lambs, I give God one. It's that He gets the first lamb. See, what faith does it really take to trust God and making Him first if we pay all our bills and then pay Him? But instead, it's about making Him first. Okay? And this is a test. The word tithe is translated tenth or tenth part. The number 10 in the Bible is representative of testing. That's why it's tied to tenth. Here's the thing. This is all throughout the Bible. There were 10 plagues on Pharaoh's house to test him. There are how many commandments to test us? God tested the children of Israel how many times? 10. Laban changed Jacob's wages how many times? 10. There are how many virgins waiting for the test of preparation for the bridegroom that's coming? 10. How many disciples were there? 12. That's a test, okay? Well, I just pulled y'all right in on that one, all right? There are 12, all right? All right, let's get back on it. Focus, all right? We can give the right amount with the wrong heart. Here's the thing. We can give the right amount with the wrong heart. During this generosity series, Pastor and I had a story that was shared with us, and I want to tell it. There was a family who were in this church, and they said that they had, tithing had been one of those challenges for them, but they believed that God had called them to pass this test. And so they decided that they were going to tithe no matter what. And particularly the husband was taking the lead in this because he was the man of the house. And so they decided to begin to tithe. And as soon as they had kind of made that decision between themselves, the wife lost her job. So it was like, oh, Lord, how is it that we start deciding to give and then we lose our job? But then they said, you know what? We're going to stay faithful. We're going to make God first, and we're going to tithe. So they got together to write out the bills, and their unemployment check came. And they had refigured, and then they looked at the unemployment check, and it was half of what they were expecting to get. Half. So I lose my job. I decide to tithe. I lose my job, and then it's half of what I'm expecting to get from the federal government. And so it was at this point that they're just frustrated and they're fuming, and it's just, how is this going to work out? And the wife looks at the husband and says, well, what do you want me to do? And he says, write the check. Write the tithe check. Write it out. Put it on the counter. We'll take it to church with us, and we'll see how everything works out. They write it out, and they even put Malachi chapter 3 in the memo line because they're believing God that if they take and put him first, that he will do the things that he said he would do. And so as they take and they do this, right as they have this discussion, a call comes in. And they get the call, and it says, hey, this person on the line says, I would like to hire you for several days for a project, and it's going to pay X amount. And little did that person know on the other side of the phone that exact amount was more than half of what they were expecting in their unemployment check. And what they said is that instantly we realized it's a test. It's not an amount, it's a test. It's what God wants. He wants to know if I will put him first. And here's what they did is they took that check when they got off the phone and they were praising God, and they showed their little girl. And they said, you see what this is? Do you know what this is? And she said, well, it's a check. And they said, no, it is putting God first. It is a tithe check because we believe in putting God first, because that is setting up a financial principle in her that will last for the rest of her life, that God has to be first. Now, greed also is short-sighted. It's short-sighted. You said, well, I thought greed was a planner and a saver and financial security. Well, if we go back to the story, this man built bigger barns, and he planned ahead, just not far enough ahead. He only considered the eat, drink, and be merry. He didn't consider life after time on this earth. It's short-sighted. You see, you're never going to see a hearse and then a U-Haul. Okay? Ain't nobody ever seen that. Because you don't get to take it with you. And here's the thing. This is what's so ironic about this story. and Jesus points it out. He says, you can choose to give and be generous or don't give, but somebody's going to get it anyways. So the funny thing is somebody's going to get your stuff anyways, whether you choose to be generous with it or not. As a matter of fact, it's guaranteed that you're going to part with that stuff. It's just a question of when and how. And this is what this guy didn't consider. He was too short-sighted. It's like the person who sends their junior high kid on their first trip, and they use up all their money at the first gas station, and then they got to beg off Pastor Jeff and Brittany the rest of the trip. They're short-sighted. They don't realize there's something beyond that gas station. And greed does this. It's extremely short-sighted. It doesn't consider an eternal perspective. It doesn't consider that. And the reason why is because and Jesus states it this way. He says that all you're concerned about is keeping your own stuff. But you're rich on this standard but you're not rich towards God. How do you be rich towards God? You care about the things God cares about. You fund the things God funds. You pay attention to the things God pays attention to. This whole eternal perspective. And you know what? This isn't to guilt you into anything. This is something you need, because many people in here are running a rat race. You go to the job every day and you think that all I do is live to pay the man. It's just, I go to my job every day and there's no sense of purpose in you. That's because there's no sense of eternity in you. If you saw your work as a way to fund eternity, it would completely change the way you looked at life. All of a sudden, what is mundane would become fulfilling, and what lacks purpose becomes purposeful, because you're doing something that really matters. You're doing something that actually is going to exist beyond your consumption of it. You're doing something that God cares about. And that's why Jesus said that, hey, you can be rich, but you're not rich towards God. And why this guy loses it all is because the irony is that he didn't care about past the consumption. But imagine what he could have done with the same size barns he already had, and what kind of eternal significance he could have had. See, you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. You can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead, because you can invest it in things God cares about, to where there is a return on the other side of eternity. It infuses us with joy when this takes. It takes us the picture of our lives off of self and puts them onto Christ. And it takes us off of looking at earth and makes us long for heaven. You know, I heard one author put it this way. He said, what is the point in keeping all this stuff? Why do we acquire it all? It's like someone who's from France coming to America, filling up homes full of stuff, and then going back to France. We are but a traveling people. We're not going to be here that long, because that is just short-sighted. It don't matter, because on the other side is where it'll matter. It'll be, where did you put money, and where did you help people find Christ, and how did you help disciple people? How did you care about the things that I care about? Now, the Apostle Paul, it's interesting. He takes these teachings of Jesus, and in 1 Timothy chapter 6, he unpacks these again. He unpacks these again because he wants to let Timothy know. See, and here's the thing. He only had so many chapters he could write to Timothy. So what he writes is extremely important. Now look at this. He says, command of those of you who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant. Well, arrogance is the same thing as greed. It says that it's all about me. Nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. Greed attempts to create security. But put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything. Well, greed leaves God out, but Paul says make sure he's in. Command those to them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. Verse 19, in this way they will lay up for themselves treasures as a firm foundation for when? Now? No, a coming age. Now you say, well, this is really interesting. I mean, Jesus says it, Paul says it, but I got you, Pastor Joe. You forgot part of what Paul said. What did I forget? Well, Paul addresses this to people who are rich. And I'm not rich. See, the funny thing about reading the Bible is that we do it from our perspective. And when we read things that say, to those of you who are rich or those who are wealthy, we just assume that's talking to the guy with the bigger house down the end of the street, not to ourselves. It's interesting because rich for us is a moving target. I mean, nobody in here knows what rich is because it's a moving target. It keeps changing. A Gallup poll said that people who made $30,000 a year said, what would it take to be rich? They said to make $74,000 a year. People who made $50,000 a year said that it would take $100,000 a year. People who made $100,000 a year said it would take $200,000 a year. Because once you get to that place, you just assume rich is the next step in the rat wheel. So maybe it would be wise for us to expand our perspective on how rich we really are. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a unique challenge for us here in this time of history and in this place, America. When we look at how rich we are compared to the rest of the world, if you earn $37,000 a year, you are in the top 5 wage earners in the world. If you earn $45,000 a year, you are in the top 1%. Remember the election, we talked a lot about the 1%? You didn't know that was you, did you? It's funny because we lose this perspective, but I've had friends tell me when they go to other countries that in these other countries, they talk about us like we're fairy tales. Oh, Americans are so rich. Can you believe how rich Americans are? Americans are so rich, they got cars. And most of them have more than one car. Can you believe that? And Americans are so rich, they got houses just for their cars. They got houses just to put their cars in so that it takes and it don't get wet. And Americans got clothes. Oh, my Lord, you should see the clothes that Americans have. They got them every color for every season for just different days of the week. They've got so many clothes. And the crazy thing is Americans have rooms just for clothes. I mean, nobody lives in those rooms and nobody stays in those. They're just for clothes. And Americans got so much water and it's so clean you can see straight through it. The thing is they got so much water, they spray it on the ground because they got too much and they just try to make things greener. That's the thing that we don't realize is our perspective is very narrow compared to the rest of the world when we're considering how rich we are. Most of the world lives on less than $2 a day, and that's in poverty. But here's the thing. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you're evil. That's not what this is about. But being rich does put you at a spiritual disadvantage. And you need to know it. Being rich is hard. Being rich makes it harder to depend on God because we depend on our wealth. We don't have to depend on anything else. We got all the money we need. I mean, we got all the money we need to really live. We don't have the money we want for the new TV, but we got all the money we need. Being rich distracts us from true priorities. And here's the thing. You got 2 cars, now you got 2 oil changes and 2 sets of tires. And the more you have, the more you have to worry about. Okay? Being rich is a greater responsibility. Jesus said later in this chapter, he said, "For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." This is sobering because with an internal perspective, you're going to have to answer for everything that you have. I'm going to have to answer for everything I have. Man alive. Here's the thing. Why do you suppose God made you rich? I mean, is it to retire early? I mean, ask yourself the question. Why did God make you rich? To leave it to your kids? I had one author that I read said that he doesn't believe we should leave anything to our kids because we're robbing them of learning how to trust in God. Might have a point. Did he make you rich so you can have more stuff? Lord have mercy, we got storage units full of stuff already. How much more stuff do you need? I mean, anybody watched Hoarders recently? So you won't worry? Because being rich, you don't have to worry about anything, right? I mean, your worries don't have anything to do with money, do they? Here's my advice. The antidote for a heart that is drifted towards greed is generosity. Guilt is conquered with confession, anger with forgiveness, greed with generosity. But here's the thing, you are never going to feel generous. You're never going to feel it. Because action is what God is asking us for. See, giving is the way that God chooses to change your heart. He's not going to change your heart. Giving's the way He chooses to change it. So I don't know about that. Where your treasure is where your heart will be also. Okay? That means that's not just about you can see where I'm at, but I can project where I want to be. If you've ever bought a stock, don't you start paying attention to that stock? If you want to care about what God cares about, don't worry about Him changing your heart. Take and put some money in what He cares about and see how all of a sudden the things you care about begin to change. Generosity is the antidote. And so here it's very simple what I think, as I close today, what I think we all need to do. We need to take our next step in giving. It's going to be different for every person in here, but our next step in giving. See, personally, I have always struggled with money. It's one of the things that I have struggled with my whole life because of needing that sense of status or security or all these things. And it's a constant struggle, and it never goes away. That's why it's so important not to blend over, or not to just skim past these passages of Scripture. I can tell you where I wrote my first $100 check, my first $250 check, my first $500 check, my first $1,000 check. I can show you every place, not because I had this wonderful God experience, but because it took everything in me to write the thing. But I knew that it would have a result in my heart. And so I did it out of obedience, not out of feeling. So all I'm asking today is that instead of raising our standard of living, we will raise our standard of giving. This place should be the most generous place on the face of the planet. That's why we model it with giving stuff away. It's why we don't charge for many things that we do, is because if anywhere you should find, a church should be the most generous place on the face of the planet. And its people should be the most generous because they realize that it's God who owns it, God who's given it to them. They are nothing but managers, and they're managing it in a way that God cares about. So if you're here today and you need to take that step towards trusting God and making Him first, I want to challenge you to take 30 days to tithe. 30 days. And at 30 days, if your life is not different and for a better, if God has not kept up His end of the bargain, you can quit tithing. I believe in it so much that I believe that you will experience joy, you will experience a closeness to God that you've never had, possibly financial gains, but that is not the point of why you do it. You do it to make Him first. If you're here today and you tithe, but you don't give above that, I want you to take that next step because you probably need to have your faith reignited. You probably need to be able to, I've heard people say, I wish I cared more about missions. You know how you can care more about missions? Put some money into missions. You'll care about it then. So I'm asking you to find something that you want God to ignite your heart for and sow some money into it. Because I believe that as you put your money there, your heart's not going to be far behind. Now, this is the last thing I want to tell you, is that if you're here today and you tithe and you're generous, you give above it, oftentimes that's a place that we can get stuck. We think, we look at it like writing a bill, and we think we get stuck. There's another level called sacrificial giving. And sacrificial giving is giving where it really requires faith. Many of us we give, but it's been a long time since we gave and it required faith. A couple months ago, Pastor Curtis, if you and the team would come, a couple months ago, I was having a extremely difficult time with some family members. People I cared deeply about. People that it was killing me what was going on in my family at the time. And they were just far from God, and the harder I tried to push them to God, the further they got. And it began, and I didn't know that we would keep that relationship. And it was during this time that God challenged me, not in related to this, He just challenged me about giving. And He said, I want you to make a sacrificial gift, something that really does challenge your budget, something you got to give in faith. I said, well, God, what do you want me to give to? And He said, well, there's a church plant that's 10 hours away that you've heard about. You don't know the pastor. You don't know anything about it. You don't have any reference point. But I want you to sow some money into that. I said, well, how much money do you want to sow, God? And He told me, and I wrote a check that affected our budget. I wrote a check that we had to plan to write. And I sent it, and I don't know what, I just sent it. It was out of obedience. There was nothing else. I just wanted to be, I didn't want God to ever say that I didn't do the things that He asked me to do. Well, a few months passed, and some time had went by this relationship had deteriorated where we weren't talking much. And several months went past, and they called, and it was unusual that they would call. And I could tell that the relationship was a little better, and that there seemed to be some grace in the situation. And they said to me, I want you to know that we've started going to church. I said, that's awesome. I feel like that's what you need. I'm so happy. And I didn't want to be over pushy, so I didn't ask too much. And they said, yeah, it's just some church plant that just started, and nobody knows much about it. There's only about 40 of us there. But we just feel like we connect to God. And God just reminded me. He said, it's not about an amount. It's just about making me first and trusting me that what I ask you to do with it. And if you'll do that, on the other side of it is this immense relationship that money could never buy. It's a relationship that, it's not a dollar amount, it's something just more. It's what Jesus promised when he said, I will give you life. You can have life, meaning your stuff is met, or you can have it more abundantly, meaning it's bigger, it's rich towards God. And that's what I want for your life today. We're not begging for your money. We don't need it. God is our source, not you guys. And I don't want to be disrespectful. You're very generous people, but I'm saying God is our source. This is his church, not our church. He takes care of the bills. What I want for you is to see a connection between faith and money, and that you will only go so far until you trust God, your trust for God blends into your possessions. I want you to see that you need to take a next step in giving, not because this is fundraising, but because you need it, not us. Because you need to know what it's like to have that abundant life, a bigger and more fuller relationship with Christ. If you'll stand all over this house today.